Hi guys, let's start on chapter 1.2. Please make sure that you have your guided notes available. Variables are the characteristics on individuals on which we collect information. So these are the questions that we ask. Collectively, the values we record or measure for individuals are the data. So data is a plural. Most people don't treat it like one, but it is a plural. So variables are the questions we ask. Data are the answers we get. And statistics is what we calculate based on the data. So there are three very different things. Variables, the question we ask. Data is the information we collect. And statistic is what we compute from the data. For this example here, the questions that were asked, the variables are name, age, length of foot, length of hand, height, gender, and arm span. Those are all variables. Those are all questions that these people were asked. The answers that we get, Brooke, Catherine, John, Josh, Brad, those are answers, right? Their age that they gave us, those numbers, those are answers. This is the data, okay? So along the top there, that's our variables. The information in the table, that is our data. If I compute the average age of this data, that would be a statistic. Okay, so three very different things there. Qualitative data is pretty much anything that's not a number. If I ask you what your shirt's made of, is it cotton, polyester? That would be qualitative data. Going back to our last example there, when they were asked their name, that's qualitative data. It is not a number. Quantitative data, think quantity versus quality. Quantitative data is numbers, right? So it can be, I counted up something, I count how many years old I am, or it can be a measurement. I can be measuring what my hand span is, okay? So different measurements for that. So there's 4 total different kinds of data. First 2 we're going to talk about are both qualitative. So think quality. So these are the non-numerical ones. So there are 2 different kinds of qualitative variables. There's ordinal, where you hear it and you're like, yep, that has an order to it, versus nominal, which doesn't have an order. So ordinal might be like alphabetic, right? That's not a number, but we know that the alphabet has a certain order that it goes in, A, B, C. Whereas nominal variables do not have a natural ordering, like what color is your hair? Well, blonde doesn't go before brown, and brown doesn't go before blonde. There's no particular order it needs to be in, so that would be a nominal variable. Then there's 2 types of quantitative data. So 2 types of numbered data. The first one is discrete. That's when I count something up. Like, how many times have I been to the Grand Canyon? I can count those. How many siblings do I have? I can count them. Versus a continuous, which is more like a measurement. That's like, how tall are you? I can measure that. How many square feet are in your home? You can measure it. So continuous variable is something that is measurable. So think count for discrete and measurement for continuous. Take a moment to please pause the video and go through these and see if you can decide if they are nominal, ordinal, discrete, or continuous. Please remember what I said last video, that by taking a moment and thinking about it before you hear the answer, you are much more likely to retain this information by the time we get around to the final exam. Okay? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so our answers are quantitative continuous for height, quantitative continuous for age. That one could be arguable. You could say that you count your age. To that effect, if you get this wrong on an exam and you'd like to discuss it with me, please come to office hours. Number of siblings, quantitative discrete. Place of birth, qualitative nominal. Number of credit hours, quantitative discrete. Favorite song, qualitative nominal. Ounces of coffee consumed per day, quantitative continuous. Number of times visited by the Grand Canyon, quantitative discrete. Letter grade earned in a course, qualitative ordinal. So if you have different answers for these, but you feel strongly that it matched the definition, that's not crazy unlikely. Sometimes that does happen, that you're thinking about it in a slightly different way, and it depends on how you are defining some of these things. And that would be a discussion I'd love to have with you in class. And we're going to go ahead and head right into chapter 1.3, design of experiments. Experimental units are the individuals who are studied. These can be people, animals, plants, or things. While the experimental units are people, they are sometimes called subjects. Okay, so usually when I'm talking about something, I'm going to talk about it like people were sampled. But yeah, that's not always the case. Sometimes they could be boxes of cereal, they could be cookies, right? They could be dolls, like literally anything that could be studied. Treatments are the procedures applied to an experimental unit, right? So if I'm studying different kinds of fertilizers on plants, the experimental units would be the plants, and the treatments would be the different fertilizers I could give them. The outcome or response is what is measured on each experimental unit. So that's the data we collect. So there are several different types of studies. There's the random experimental study, and there's an observational study. In the experimental study, we assign treatments and observe the effects. So that's what you see when you usually see like medication studies, where I'm going to give this group a medication, I'm going to give this group a placebo. This is an experimental study. I have applied a treatment. In an observational study, we observe specific characteristics of something in its own environment. This can mean that we get some cross-contamination with our data. It's not necessarily correlational. With observational studies, it can be a little bit more tricky to decide that. However, sometimes there are things that we can't replicate through an experimental study, or we don't have the resources to do so, or it might even be unethical to do so. For example, one of the studies we're going to do later was on lead, the effects of lead in children. And it would be unethical to expose children to lead. So we work with what we have. We would not do an experimental study exposing children to lead. So what type of study would you say that these are? So the first one is a Southwest Airlines surveyed passengers on a flight from Phoenix to San Diego and determined that 82% of them were happy with the flight. Go ahead and pause and see if you can answer that question. All right, so for problem A there, that would be observational. They were already on the flight, and then you're seeing what their response is. A company had consumers do a blind taste test of a cupcake and a healthier cupcake to see if they could tell the difference between. 25% correctly identified the cupcake. That would be experimental. You took people and you gave them a treatment of a cupcake, right, to see what would happen. That was experimental. Pew Research Center surveyed 2,252 adults and found that 59% of them go online wirelessly. That would be observational. These people were already doing what they were doing, and they just observed what percent of them go online wirelessly. All right, and then let's finish off chapter 1 here. Chapter 1.4, bias in studies. This one's an interesting one to discuss. So studies conducted with methods that tend to underestimate or overestimate the values are said to be biased. A study conducted by a procedure that produces the correct result on average is said to be unbiased. So even if a study is a little bit off, if it's on average, if you kept replicating the study, if it would get around the correct result, then it is unbiased. First one is the voluntary response bias. We talked a little bit about this during the sampling techniques, right? People with strong emotions are more likely to volunteer their response. This is not saying that we need to be forcing people to participate. It's more that, like, if you gave out tons and tons of flyers and only the people who volunteered to give them back, that's voluntary response. Self-interest bias. people who have an interest in the outcome of an experiment and are incentivized to use biased methods. So you see this a lot, or I shouldn't say that you see this a lot. This is what you think of when you hear bias, when someone actively is trying to create bias to get the results that they want. Sometimes you can have accidental bias, and that's what we're talking about with some of these other ones. But this one, self-interest bias, is the one that most people think of. Social acceptability bias. People may be reluctant to admit behavior that they feel can reflect negatively on them. One project some of my students did once, they wanted to do a study on if people wear socks to bed, and they could not get anyone to answer their question because for some reason there was some social acceptability bias. People were uncomfortable with answering the question, do you wear socks to bed? And so the people who did answer, there could be something different about them than the rest of the population because this question made people socially uncomfortable. So sometimes you'd have to think about social acceptability bias and how you're running your study. Leading question bias. Sometimes if you word a question in a certain way, it can influence how people answer. One example from a study one of my students did was they wanted to know if people who are from Arizona versus out of state prefer warm weather or cold weather, how those rates compared. So, but when they asked their question was, do you prefer it when it is cold or when it is warm? And the connotation of cold versus cool and warm versus hot, right? That felt like it was slightly biased by saying warm instead of hot, as hot is the opposite of cold. So we had to talk about, this was a little bit of leading question bias. It wasn't on purpose, but it was something that occurred, and you have to very carefully read over questions as you ask and make sure that you're not influencing the people reading them or discussing the questions with you. Non-response bias. This kind of goes hand in hand with voluntary response bias. It's when you try to sample a lot of people, but there are a lot of non-responses. So, and this kind of goes along with the whole socks to bed thing. They didn't get a lot of people to answer their question. So the people who did respond might have something different about them than the people who did not choose to respond. Sampling bias. This samples of convenience are always sampling bias. It's when you don't use a well-defined method to collect your sample. All right, go ahead and pause the video and read over these, and go ahead and see if you can determine what kind of bias you would assign to these situations. And then we're going to do this in class. So you can always go ahead and get a head start on it, read it through, see what you think, and answer those questions.